The Tax Factor from Blick Rothenberg.
Friday, 5th of July, 2024.
Good morning, Britain. The country is waking up to a Labour landslide as the party sweeps to victory in the general election.
We did it! You campaigned for it, you fought for it, you voted for it, and now it has arrived. Change begins now.
The Tax Factor, Election 24, with Nimesh, Shah and Heather Self.
Welcome to The Tax Factor, the top 20 business and investment podcast from Blick Rothenberg, which brings you all the latest news and updates in the world of tax and provides analysis of what it might mean for you or your business. I'm Nimesh Shah, CEO of Blick Rothenberg.
And I'm Heather Self.
So, Heather, who would have thought after all these weeks of talking, we would finally have got here to the monumental moment? And of course, I mean the final episode of this series of The Tax Factor. Actually, there's also been a general election overnight. Let's just go straight in, Heather. I don't know about you, but I stayed up as long as I could do last night to see which of those seats were changing hands. And there's been lots of changing of seats, given that major Labour landslide victory today.
I think my highlight has got to be Rachel Reeves. I think we're finally going to have our first female Chancellor of the Exchequer. She'll be the first one in 803 years and about blooming time. Interestingly, Jeremy Hunt just about retained his seat, so I think he'll be quite an effective shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer. He was very much on top of his brief as Chancellor. But quite late on overnight, I think it was about 6:30 this morning, we heard that Liz Truss had narrowly lost her seat, having had a very significant majority at the last election. And I think that is partly probably a personal verdict, but also a verdict on the car crash budget in her brief period as Prime Minister. So a clear signal there to Rachel Reeves that she can't just go out and borrow without good statistics to back it up. The other one that I noticed, perhaps a less well-known figure, in Wales, Torsten Bell has been elected for Labour. Now, he's been the chief executive of the Resolution Foundation, which is a think tank which particularly analyses the impact of policy on the lower paid. It's going to be interesting to have him with his very deep technical knowledge in Parliament and available to the Treasury team.
Yeah, that one passed me by until you mentioned it. Well, I think that's going to be a really good thing to have Torsten's influence within the Labour Party, and hopefully, he can certainly shape Rachel Reeves' thinking, especially around some of the tax anomalies that we have for the lower paid. Hurrah to Torsten. And I would add as well, Liz Truss's partner in crime, Kwasi Kwarteng, did decide to stand down before the election. So both the Kwarteng-Liz Truss mini-budget car crash that we saw, both of them remain out of government for the next Parliament. And as you said, Heather, I completely endorse that that was a big signal in this particular election that the effect of that mini-budget did have a damaging effect on the Conservative electorate. Let's talk about Rachel Reeves. Now, I've got a lot of time for Rachel Reeves. I've heard her speak on a number of occasions. I think she's a really sensible economist. She's a Brownite, my favourite Chancellor of the past couple of decades as well. And apparently she had a picture of Gordon Brown hanging from her college room at Oxford University. What do you think about Rachel Reeves, Heather? What do you think we might see from her?
Well, I think with both Rachel Reeves and the Labour leader, Keir Starmer, I think it's encouraging that both of them have had what I would call proper jobs before coming into Parliament. Keir Starmer, of course, a very experienced barrister, and then he was the DPP for a number of years, Director of Public Prosecutions. Rachel Reeves, trained as an economist, worked for the Bank of England, has also worked over in the USA, really bringing some deep outside knowledge. And I think they've worked very hard to build relations with business over the last 12 months or so. And I think business has been pretty supportive of where they're hoping to go.
Yeah, some pretty high-profile business owners, entrepreneurs, and also individuals and businesses in the finance industry in particular have thrown their support behind Labour during the election campaign. So that's going to be quite telling. But if we think about what Reeves maybe now turning her attention to on day one of this new Labour government. The manifesto talked about some business tax roadmap. What are your thoughts, Heather, about what we might see there? Because they've committed to not increasing corporation tax from its current level of 25%, which was a Sunak measure that then got canned for a short period of time under the Liz Truss Kwarteng regime, and then it got brought back by Jeremy Hunt. So that 25% is here to stay. But what more can we do around business taxes?
I'm delighted they're going to have a roadmap, and I'd just like to point out that I first suggested this to the incoming Tony Blair government in 1997, so I'm very glad that a Labour government's finally listening to me. The benefit of a business tax roadmap is that it does help investment decisions, particularly the big decisions. If you're looking to build new hospitals, new wind farms, new data centres, you want to know what the tax system is going to be over the medium term, not just what it is next year. The Labour Party have been very clear they want to encourage investment. They've said they're going to do other things around the planning system to make infrastructure projects a priority. And I think having a stable tax system is going to be a big part of that. I think I mentioned on last week's episode that I'd been at a recent conference where a number of business tax leaders were saying that actually the rate of tax is less important than the stability.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. It has yo-yoed around a little bit on business taxes. And I know that a number of the smaller businesses that we talk to are kind of confused as to where they are in terms of business taxation and the compliance aspects as well. One of the things that caught my eye is around the full expensing regime, which has been, again, a bit of a hybrid of a Sunak and Hunt measure over the last few years. But it's still quite fiddly, quite complicated. Do you think that Reeves might do something again to unlock the potential of business investment and entrepreneurship in the UK?
They've said they'll commit to permanent full investment relief, which, as you've said, was introduced by Sunak a year or two ago. For smaller businesses, the problem has been the annual investment allowance, the amount that a small business can deduct for its capital expenditure each year, that has swithered around, that's been 250,000 and then up and then down and then up and then down. That's now settled at $1 million. And I think for the vast majority of businesses, actually that's a more important measure, because there's only something like 5% of companies that spend more than £1 million on capital equipment each year. So I think that is an area where you need two different systems. I think the vast majority of smaller businesses just need to know that they can deduct what they spend on their new computers, their new office furniture and so on each year. The bigger businesses are looking at the large infrastructure projects and need to know how to price those to get a reasonable return on an after-tax basis. So that's quite a clear divide between the large and the small needs there.
Labour also talked about, maybe I'm reading slightly too much into this, but as well as investment for the business itself, they mention in their manifesto, which I have to say was a really difficult read. It was very poorly worded in my view, but putting that to one side, they did talk about business taxes for investors as well. Now, there's been quite a bit of speculation over the last few weeks because Keir Starmer in particular has not come out and committed to not increasing capital gains tax as well. And I wonder what we'll see here for particularly entrepreneurs who have invested in their business, looking to sell. We've had a generous, I suppose, capital gains tax regime up until, again, the Sunak regime. It was 10 million at 10%. That now is 1 million at 10%, but actually 20% on the balance is not a bad rate. And there is plenty of speculation that that 20% rate might increase to as high as 40, possibly even aligned to income tax with an inflation allowance thrown in there as well. But for a business owner who's subscribed a nominal amount for their initial shares in that business, that inflation allowance is not going to mean too much if that is introduced. But do you see anything, Heather, that Labour might do around capital gains taxes?
I think that could be an area where they really do some serious reform. It's worth remembering that the original entrepreneurs relief was introduced by a Labour government, so they're clearly keen to support entrepreneurs. But the way that it works at the moment, the IFS, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, have criticised it quite heavily because it provides the incentive at the wrong time. It gives an incentive when somebody sells a business, whereas what they really want to do is incentivize people at the beginning. So I think what we might see is a phasing out of business asset disposal relief and being replaced by something which gives you relief on the way in. Now, that might mean that if you're wanting to sell your business, you'll still get your relief provided you go into a new business, but I think it might hurt those who are looking to retire completely. And that's going to be a very difficult juggling act. In terms of the rates of capital gains tax, I think you've pointed out, Nimesh, we've got something like 5 potential rates of capital gains tax at the moment, which is a nonsense. So I really hope that's an area where we might get some simplification. And my personal view is we might see perhaps 2 rates, a lower rate for business assets and a higher rate for everything else. And the non-business assets, really the people who've got significant capital gains are the top 5%, probably even the top 1% of the population. And I think we might see perhaps not as high as a 40-45% rate, but it wouldn't surprise me to see perhaps a relatively generous rate for business assets, perhaps sticking at the 20%, and non-business assets 40% or somewhere close to it. And I don't think we're going to see an indexation allowance. And there's two reasons for that. One is it's horribly complicated. Second, and I can remember how it used to work. But the other key point is that one of the expert advisors who's been working on a small expert panel with Labour is Sir Edward Troop, former head of HMRC. And I saw his reaction at a conference about a year ago when someone suggested introducing indexation allowance, and it was more or less, please God, no. So I suspect what they will do, particularly now that inflation has come down to a lower rate, what they will do is rather than have an alignment of rates with income tax and then give you indexation allowance, they'll do a broad brush. Let's have a rate of, say, 80% of the income tax rate, and that gives you some allowance for inflation without the complexity.
And you mentioned, I have to pick up on this, Heather, you mentioned about two different rates for non-business assets and business assets. This sounds very familiar to taper relief, which was one of my favourite things to do over 15 years ago now. I loved the taper relief regime. It was viciously complicated, for one, and it was hugely valuable as well. Unlimited taper relief. And if you were fortunate enough, you'd get 10% CGT rate on business assets at an unlimited level. And I have heard some rumours that, again, Rachel Reeves being a Brownite, that she may look to reintroduce taper relief in some form. But I agree with you that inflation allowance is viciously complicated and is something that we could do without. But what we might see over the next few months, a number of business owners speculating that CGT rates may go up, and possibly an overnight change on the next budget day, which is expected to be around September, October. Any thoughts on, if you're a business owner, do you think you should be locking in and selling your business or crystallising a disposal before budget day?
There's always the advice that don't ever do anything just for tax reasons, because if the market starts to expect that capital gains tax rates are going to go up, then that could in itself affect the pricing of the business. We need to see how the stock markets are going to react to the Labour victory. If you've got a good offer for your business, yes, I would exchange contracts before the next budget rather than afterwards, because even if they bring it in overnight, there's usually, well, I think there's always been an allowance for anything where you've actually entered into the contract before budget day, because of course it's the date of the contract rather than the date of completion. What I wouldn't do, and there was a lot of this a few years ago when there were rumours about capital gains tax, is try and do complicated things with options to give yourself hopefully the upside of getting the lower rate if things change in the budget. I think that could go very badly wrong.
Oh yeah, please, none of that nonsense again this time round. Let's turn our attention to maybe savers as well. They're going to be impacted maybe by changes to capital gains taxes. But Labour have backed themselves into a corner here. They've said no increases to income tax, VAT, national insurance and corporation tax. Over 80% of the tax take comes from those four taxes. But for savers, there might be some nuances here. Dividend taxes are slightly lower than the main rates of income tax. What could the regime look like for savers? Because that's got to be an area where Labour might be able to raise a bit more money than beyond what they've said in their manifesto, which I think adds up to about 20 billion of additional taxes. It's not really going to do too much for the total tax take.
Again, if you look beyond the very wealthy, the people with very large private offices and so on, who've got perhaps the tens of millions invested, for anybody below that level, you can have an awful lot in an ISA at the moment. 20,000 a year. There are plenty of people who by now will have built up as much as perhaps £1 million in an ISA. So it's already possible to get large amounts of income tax free. They might restrict the total amount you can have in an ISA, in the same way that we might see a restriction on pension tax-free lump sums. There might be a cap on those. But I can't see that they're going to get significantly more tax from savers while people have got the option to put money into an ISA.
Yeah, and you touched then on pensions as well. So Labour had been really vocal around reinstating the lifetime allowance. Now, I think that may have gone away, but it may come back at the next budget. But there's threats all over the place here around contributions or into pension schemes and whether relief might be curtailed to the basic rate. Is the tax-free lump sum up for grabs, and will additional taxes be applied on pension earnings as well? If had a miracle happen and the Conservatives got in, they pledged this horrible system of this triple lock plus to enhance the personal allowance. Now, Labour didn't come out and say anything similar, so we might see some pushback from pensioners about what may happen around their taxes on their pension income. Let's move away from pensions, and as I said, they've kind of backed themselves into the corner on this triple lock or quadruple lock on the big 3 or 4 taxes. But we do know one thing that has gained so much press attention, probably too much press attention in my view, which is VAT on private school fees. So we think that's a dead cert. That is going to come in, albeit sensibly. Rachel Reeves has said that it won't happen until the start of the next school term in September 2025. So there's a 1-year grace period, but lots of stories around prepaying. Have you got, I know we've talked about this on previous episodes, Heather, of the tax factor, but what's your view on prepayment of school fees? I've seen lots of conflicting views on this.
I think prepaying the year's school fees is quite a sensible thing to do. And when my children were in private school, you actually got a reasonable discount on paying 12 months fees in June before the next school year started. Any more than that, I was always a bit worried that the school might go bust. But also, I think the way that schools account for prepaid fees, it's not really a prepayment in VAT terms quite often, because quite often the school will just hold it in a separate account and you get the money back if certain things happen. Arguably, that then hasn't triggered the supply point for VAT purposes. So I think genuinely paying something which you can't get back, provided you're happy with the risk of doing that, is probably going to work. And question is whether you need to do that before the next budget. But given that she said she'll give a year's grace, I think that's actually going to be the position, that you're fine for the next academic year if you really can't afford another 15 or 20% on school fees. And I say 15% because schools will be able to get some of their VAT costs back, and also they might absorb some of the cost of the VAT increase. But if as a parent you really can't afford that, then you've got a year to work out where you're going to move your child to, frankly.
And you may want to move your child to sunnier shores, because if you're a non-dom that's come to the UK to put your children in private school in the UK, they've got to be concerned right now, sat here on the day after the general election and a Labour landslide victory, that the Labour Party have said they're going to abolish the non-dom regime once and for all. I don't really know what that means, because I think Jeremy Hunt did that in the spring budget, but there are going to be, in their words, so-called conservative loopholes that will be closed around a deduction for foreign income in that first year and inheritance taxes applied on offshore trusts. Now, there's lots of lobbying, I believe, going on behind the scenes on the non-dom regime and what might be done around particular reform on that. I have a real interest in this area. I've been working with non-doms for well over 15 years now, and I think that the Conservative haphazard way of introducing the reforms were a car crash, really, and created lots of uncertainty for non-doms. And we've seen plenty of press articles of very wealthy non-doms going off to the UAE and Italy and Monaco. I wonder, and maybe it's slightly optimistic thinking on my part, but given the huge Labour landslide victory, and not only just for non-doms, but for some other areas of taxation, I wonder if Rachel Reeves might just pause and listen to some of the interest on non-doms in particular. Does she need to rush and introduce something, Heather? Could she take some views and there be a consultation around what a world-class non-dom policy could look like, aligned, I think, actually with an investment regime, an immigration regime, and what that may link into international trade as well? What are the hopes of Rachel Reeves, I suppose, pausing on non-doms, but also wider on taxation as well?
Being deeply cynical, the two biggest reforming chancellors I've known in my very long time in tax, I think, were Nigel Lawson and Gordon Brown. And both of them did significant change relatively early in a government. And the advantage of doing it fairly early on is that if you do something unpopular, there's time for people to forget it before the next election. So I think the time to be radical is either the first or second budget of a new parliament, and not beyond that.
I agree with you. History says that you get the bad news out of the way in that very first budget. And as I keep saying, I think because Labour have backed themselves into a corner on those big 4 taxes, there has to be some bad news around capital gains tax, non-doms. Where are they going to get this money from because of the size of the national debt? And also the really good pledges and policies that they want to drive through change in the country as well. Speaking of something then that is unpopular, HMRC. Labour have said that they're going to generate quite a sizable chunk of that additional 20 billion that I mentioned from closing the tax gap and tackling tax avoidance through around an 850 million investment into HMRC. Now, personally, I don't think that's going to scratch the surface when they can't answer the phones. But you did spot, actually very timely, a case only over the last few days that just shows the cataclysmic errors that we see with HMRC that cost the taxpayer so much money. Can we just briefly touch on this case, Heather? Because I think it has caught the eye of many people.
So this is an extremely well-known former solicitor and barrister called Paul Baxendale Walker. I'm not going to say too much about him, but if you want to look up his Wikipedia entry, it is quite startling. He was one of the major promoters of tax avoidance schemes in the 1990s and 2000s. And in particular, I think he was the evil genius perhaps behind a lot of the failed loan charge schemes. The latest case concerns HMRC's effort to impose a £14 million penalty on him, which they failed to do by, frankly, getting the basics wrong, by not following up on due dates for enforcement notices and getting some of the detailed processes wrong, which is a real shame. And I think it is symptomatic of the fact that HMRC are quite demoralised at the moment, that they haven't been given the investment they need. I worked in HMRC, it's now about 15 years ago, and there are some really good people there, but they're deeply fed up. And I hope that one thing Labour will do is actually rebuild that sense of pride and professionalism in the civil service generally and in HMRC in particular.
I couldn't agree more. I think HMRC are feeling pretty downbeat and being bashed over the last few years. And actually, we shouldn't sit in our ivory towers here, Heather, on the tax factor, because we have also been fairly critical of some of the HMRC actions that we've seen. But I would love to see a real positive force from Rachel Reeves around the importance of HMRC, giving them that backing, giving them that investment, and really getting the compliance aspects of the job right in the first place. But I think there's a huge job still for Rachel Reeves and this Labour government around simplification of the tax system, because as much as HMRC will get money thrown at them and backing, I think they've just got such a huge job to deal with the ballooning tax code here. And maybe we'll finish up. If you were now advising Rachel Reeves on day one on what she should be thinking about, given the backdrop of a huge Labour landslide victory, they've got a real mandate for change. They get this right, they're probably in for at least the next decade, if not more. What would you be saying to Heather over a cup of coffee right now to Rachel Reeves?
I think that getting it right is more important than doing it quickly. Funnily enough, I was actually chatting to somebody in the Treasury quite recently, and he was asking me for my views on how tax consultation could be done better. And it's about having a process that starts early enough and gives time to get to an answer that works, rather than doing something in a rush and ending up with something which is bodged. And I gave IR35 as the paradigm example. It was brought in too quickly. We knew that it wasn't going to work well from day one, and yet it was left for almost 20 years before any changes have been made. Whereas if another 12 months had been spent before introducing it, we could perhaps have had something that worked from day one.
I couldn't agree with you more, Heather. I would love to see Rachel Reeves take her time. I think she could set a real clear tax strategy in that first budget. I know what we said before about getting some of the bad news out of the way quickly. I don't think she necessarily needs to pull a trigger on day one, given the mandate that Labour have been given today. And setting a clear direction, a simplification agenda, something that aligns as well to the wider investment and economic remit here. I would really like as well, in an ideal world, for Rachel Reeves and the government not to set tax policy. I would like an independent think tank, or an independent body, I should say, to set our tax strategy that aligns with the wider government economic policy and fiscal policy that we have. But I think that's probably a step too far, because given how political tax has become over the last decade, I don't think the government and Rachel Reeves are ready to quite give up that power as well.
They could reinstate the Office of Tax Simplification. That would be a good step.
Yeah, and it's quite telling that that wasn't mentioned in anyone's manifestos as well. If you are going to do that, then it needs to be taken seriously, because I don't think the OTS did get the backing. I don't think they got the funding. They did actually very little because they weren't given that support. So, look, I completely agree. I think there is a role for something like the OTS, but they need to be given more power for real change. And on that note, we have run out of time for today, and indeed for this series of The Tax Factor. My thanks to Heather for taking us through what has been an amazing election campaign as far as taxes are concerned. I've never been part of an election campaign that has seen tax dominate so much. When we planned our summer break, we never envisioned that we'd have a Dallas style, we'd leave you with a season cliffhanger. And this isn't a dream. Labour have won a landslide majority, a historic victory today. So what will come next? Well, we'll just have to wait and see. But you can see that we'll have plenty to talk about on the next edition of The Tax Factor, which returns on Friday, the 23rd of August. As usual, we'll bring you all the latest tax news and analysis from our regular team and with some new voices as well. And we will be looking forward to that very first Rachel Reeves budget. I cannot wait.
The Tax Factor, Election 24.
Whilst we're away, please check our website for updates and insights, www.blickrothenberg.com.
And as this is the last edition of The Tax Factor, I'd personally like to thank all the presenters over the last 47 weeks. The team behind the podcast at Blick Rothenberg, Michael, Celia and Dan, and the production team who help bring it all together every week. Josh, Agnes, Lucy and Care. And not forgetting our very own voice of God, Darren, who introduces us every week. Thank you so much for listening. Your feedback and making us a top 20 UK podcast is an incredibly proud moment for me and the entire Tax Factor team. It's been amazing to see the Tax Factor alongside Moneybox, Martin Lewis, and Stephen Bartlett, of course. We have an ambition to knock Stephen Bartlett off the top spot, so please help us out in Series 2 of the Tax Factor.
I'm Heather Self. Until next time, have a lovely summer.
And I'm Nimesh Shah. We are back in August. Goodbye and enjoy the weekend.
That's the Tax Factor. We're taking a short summer break, but we'll be back in August with more tax news and updates. You can listen to previous episodes of the Tax Factor on all the top podcast platforms. And subscribe to make sure you don't miss new updates. Until next time, it's also goodbye from me. The Tax Factor from Blick Rothenberg.